Hello, friends. On this glorious day in drink history, we are going to talk vermouth. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we have John Troia on this fine episode of the Educational Drinking Show. You might know Mr. Troia from his line of Tempus, Fugit liqueurs. And if this is the case, then you know that when he releases a historically inspired spirit, it is the real deal. And his release of 4 vermouths under the Alessio label are no exception, with Michael Paternity of the Wall Street Journal saying this about the Alessio Vermouth di Torino. Quote, "On the third evening, I went back to the vermouth at room temperature, and lo and behold, it had shape-shifted yet again. This time I could almost taste the Turin cafes and the first dulcet notes, and Alessio's forest floors and open fields in the last more bitter ones. The truth was, with each passing night I was being acculturated by this vermouth. I looked at my father, beaming that same appreciation, and thought, well, here it is in a bottle, the history we both own and have lost." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the kind of emotional connection a great spirit can create. And it's one of the fundamental aspects of this world of spirits that inspires me beyond explanation. John Troia has come as close as anyone when it comes to mixing time travel and spirits, and he's become a fixture in cocktail culture for being an encyclopedia of knowledge that is always willing to generously share what he's learned in the most passionate way possible. Let's do this. This episode of the Educational Drinking Show is sponsored by Junipero Gin, which is the original American craft gin going back to 1996 and the pioneering work of Fritz Maytag, which also makes it the gin of San Francisco. At 98.6 proof, it's a bit stronger than most gins and perfect in your favorite gin cocktail. Good stuff. And now it's my great pleasure to share with you my interview with John Troia.
There's been this greater awareness and appreciation and as a result, a demand for a greater quality of products. And since our focus prior to working on a line of vermouths had been really resurrecting a much maligned category of cremes that had deteriorated to the point to where people felt they were somewhat of an afterthought. Based upon our research and based upon are developing these older historic creme and liqueur recipes, it wasn't lost on us that the way the things were done historically were significantly better than what we had today. So we figured on the notion that, well, what if this also applies to vermouths? I think it was very obvious that there was kind of a lower tier quality of vermouths out there. And there are some newer, better quality vermouths coming to the forefront that bartenders were very excited about and enjoyed. And for us, there was a great appreciation of those products, but the question in our mind was, could they be something better than what even now is starting to come to the forefront? So, we went back to the historic roots of the vermouths, and with the understanding and appreciating, similar to the cremes and the vermouth and the liqueurs, that these things existed before cocktails. So what were they like? How were they consumed? And, what were those kinds of attributes? And so we took that same approach with the vermouths. Knowing that vermouths existed before cocktails, how did people consume them? And they consumed them on their own, or in a number of cases, they'd have it with a splash of seltzer or soda water because they felt at the time that the effervescent qualities of the sparkling water also had healthful properties. Because again, just like cremes and liqueurs and things like absinthe, etc., many of these products had roots as medicines first, and then they kind of evolved as more of a recreational consumption. And so that was the same with vermouth. I mean, the very origins of vermouth were really as a medicinal property. And then it became something that people enjoyed recreationally, and then ultimately it became an essential ingredient in a cocktail. So our primary focus was, let's look at historic recipes that created a vermouth that was enjoyable and balanced on its own, and then see if that also translated into a high quality vermouth that could be used in a cocktail. So that was our primary focus: is, can you drink this on its own, and would you enjoy it on its own? And our assumption or hypothesis is, if we achieve that milestone, then it was going to be a no-brainer that's going to work exceptionally well in a cocktail. So that's really where I think we start to differentiate ourselves, as we pay a lot of attention to the individual quality and the balance of the vermouths themselves as a standalone drinking product, where it's, you open a bottle, you pour it in a glass, and you enjoy it that way. And then if you want to use it in a cocktail, bonus, because it's going to be exceptional.
Perfect. Give me just 1 second. You have the sun behind you. I'm just going to scoot this light off to the side a little bit. It's not terrible, but we can do better. There we go.
Did we capture all that? Because don't ask me to say it again.
Nope, not at all. Like a stud. One take Troia.
One take Troia. Scary.
Okay, so when you're looking back at the history of vermouth, doing your research, where does that history really begin?
Well, it really begins in the Piedmont region, and you can drill back even further into medieval times. You know, if you want to talk about the history of vermouth in general, you're really talking about a wine that's been aromatized with herbs, a la the medicinal aspect of it. And Hippocrates, gets a lot of credit for coming up with these so-called medicinal wines, where you're going ahead and aromatizing the wine by soaking wormwood in it, which is really where vermouth gets its name. Vermouth being the German word for wormwood, essentially a wormwood wine, and the benefit of wormwood in terms of its medicinal qualities as almost a human dewormer, if you will. Essentially, the way wormwood got its name wormwood is that by soaking it in wine, the low alcohol level of the wine would extract bitter components from the wormwood plant. And when you drink that, and of course if you'd sweeten it as well, it makes it a little easier to drink and to taper off the bitterness. But when you drink that those bitter essential oils help remove intestinal parasites and stomach worms and the like. And so that's really how wormwood got its name, is kind of like a human dewormer. But even in 2000 BC or so, the Egyptians were creating wine where they would add different flavors. In biblical times, things like frankincense and myrrh were valuable resins that were sometimes infused in wine as well to flavor it and aromatize it. In many cases, it was a medicinal application. Sometimes there were some religious applications to it as well. But so you could talk about flavored wines as being really the earliest inceptions of vermouths, but from a modern context, you could start to look towards the European continent, where you have really the area of Piedmont, which was the Duchy of Savoy within the Kingdom of Sardinia, which encompassed really three countries, primarily Italy and France, and then tertiarily Switzerland. And as the borders became more solidified between countries, quite specifically in 1860, you essentially have the separation of that historic kingdom into Chambray in the French side of things, and Turin on the Italian side of things. And they're all kind of within the shadow of the Swiss Alps. And so you'll see in vermouths the use of a lot of mountain or alpine herbs. And then you also will end up getting a lot of herbs coming in through the Mediterranean corridor, things like coriander and things like that. And so it's these trade routes through the Venetian traders that, for example, that are giving you these rare herbs and spices that were used to aromatize the wine, of course, with the wormwood. And so that's kind of the historic epicenter of really the modern vermouth. There of course were aspects of the Holy Roman Empire in Hungarian Tokaj that was being aromatized with wormwood from Hungary, which is actually kind of interesting because being people involved in absinthe production, we've actually distilled French wormwood, Hungarian wormwood. And the interesting thing about Hungarian wormwood is it actually has a very sweet quality to it. And so by using Hungarian wormwood in a Hungarian sweet wine would be kind of a natural pairing. But this is kind of an earlier pathway or evolution in how maybe the popularity of a fortified wormwood wine evolved in favor in the French side and the Italian side of things. But historically, again, in its modern history, and we're talking, mid-19th century, early 19th century, really is kind of that Turin region and that original kingdom or Duchy of Savoy.
So can you take me through, you guys produce 4 expressions of vermouth through the Alessio brand. And in terms of production, the broad strokes of making a vermouth, what do all these have in common in terms of production?
Well, a vermouth, first and foremost, is really an aromatized wine. And aromatized wine, if I was to take a stab at a definition, is essentially taking an extraction or maceration of herbs in the wine, and then ultimately you would fortify and also sweeten the wine to come up with a finished vermouth. For the most part, what you're going to want to do is you'll bring your wine in, you'll put it in a storage vessel, a tank, if you will, and then you decide on what your recipe is. Now, you could have things such as cinnamon and coriander and ginger and nutmeg and things like this. And each of these ingredients is going to have their optimum method of extracting the flavors and the essential oils from those particular plants. And so what you'll do is you'll go ahead and do an extraction from each of those plants, and then you're going to combine them in various ratios, kind of like you would do in your kitchen if you're making a meal and following a recipe. It'd be the same kind of thing. And so you're going to create ultimately this herbal concentrate, if you will. Then what you do is you take that herbal concentrate, which is carried with it within high proof, and you add that to the wine. Now that's when you're aromatizing the wine, and that's a really important step. We will add that high proof flavor concentrate, if you will, and allow it to marry with the wine for a minimum of 4 weeks. It's stirred in the morning, it's stirred in the evening, and it's really meant to allow the essential oils to merge with the wine flavors and the base. And if you do it too quickly, then you don't have a proper marriage of those flavors. And when you taste the vermouth, ultimately they'll be kind of disjointed and it won't have this flow to it. By allowing it to marry and aromatize sufficiently, you're going to have this really good balance. The balance is brought about by the different ingredients that you use or the flavors that you use, but allowing it to marry properly is absolutely essential. So once you have gone ahead and allowed it to marry for that 4-week minimum period, then you'll go ahead and do your sugar add, and then to sweeten it, and then you would go ahead and if you want to add any additional neutral grape spirit to adjust the alcohol content, then you can definitely do that.
Now, let's go through each of the expressions and talk about them in detail. Which one do you want to do first? Choose wisely.
Yeah. I think the Bianco, owing that it's the one that I always lead with because it's the lighter expression, if you will, and the clear vermouth. The Bianco is interesting from the standpoint that it was something that was a bit of a marketing invention on the Chambray side of things. So, give the French credit for creating the Bianco. It's on a white wine base, and then you would go ahead and aromatize it. The herbs that are used tend to be less earthy than with kind of your normal darker sweet vermouth. So it's meant to be more of a lighter, clear expression that was actually meant to be marketed towards the upper society women in the large cities in Europe. Now, most of the Bianco recipes that we uncovered tended to slant towards or make heavy use of vanilla top notes, for example. But sometimes, at least in our opinion and the opinion of a number of bartenders, that can tend to slant a little more towards the cloying side because, understand that vanilla on its own isn't sweet, but the perfuminess or the aroma of vanilla gives a perception of sweetness. And when you pile that on top of an already sweetened wine base, then it could tend to get a little over the top. And so bartenders find it to be a little challenging to work with sometimes because they don't want to use too much because they're afraid that they're going to over sweeten the cocktail and they're going to over perfume the cocktail with these vanilla attributes. What we uncovered was a very interesting variation on a Bianco that was more citrus forward. So the vanilla was much more in the background, and our recipe tended to be much more forward in the citrus notes, in particular grapefruit. And what we found is that it tamped down the sweetness level. It's still very much a sweet vermouth. It's not closer to dry than it is sweet vermouth. It is definitely a sweet vermouth, but it's not as cloying. And owing to the citrus and the acidic characteristic of this recipe, it has much more versatility in a cocktail setting, especially when you consider how many cocktails benefit from citric components, whether it be lemon juice or even the garnish being a lemon peel or an orange peel or something of that sort. But what it lends in characteristic to a standalone vermouth, which again is our primary goal, is it makes for a very crisp, very refreshing, very enjoyable, balanced, lighter vermouth. I mean, it just is magnificent on its own. And I don't know if I've actually tasted anyone on it that hasn't been ranging from impressed to over the moon for it. It's just a breath of fresh air in a category that tends to be just a little bit static in terms of its flavor profile and its usability.
It's dangerously refreshing on the rocks with a twist on a summer afternoon.
That's fantastic.
It's really, really special.
Yeah.
Perhaps the Torino.
The Vermouth de Torino, a classic style of Italian sweet vermouth. It's really the Swiss Army knife of vermouths, if you will. Giving a nod to the Swiss, it is Swiss Alps. So, but the Di Torino is kind of interesting because if you, by Italian law, in order for it to be classified as a Vermouth de Torino, it needs to be made in the Turin region. It needs to utilize wormwood that's grown in the region. It doesn't require that the wine be produced or sourced from the region, but we do source our wine base from the region. So it's really a great manifestation of the heart and history of vermouth from that region because it's so marked by the terroir everything from the wine base to the wormwood in particular. Cardamom is kind of a very obvious top note for a vermouth Titurino. And I would say that as far as classic vermouth, that's about as good as it gets. I mean, in a Boulevardier, in a Manhattan, in a Negroni, it is going to give you a beautiful herbal profile to it, a really great, kind of that raisiny, winey grape contribution to the cocktail. Works especially well with, brown spirits, especially ones that have more of a caramel vanilla aspect to it, but also does well with really herbaceous gins.
Nice. And moving on to perhaps the Canado.
Which Canado?
The vermouth.
The vermouth Canado. Okay. So when you talk, so I think to take a step back and just kind of put things in context, when you say vermouth, owing that vermouth gets its word from the French translation of the German word for wormwood. So what that's speaking to is the bitter finish. The primary herb that's responsible for the bitter finish in a vermouth historically is wormwood. Canado is the Italian cousin of the Quina. Quina, a la French, is really means quinine. It's the Italian Canado is quinine. So when you think Canado, you think quinine. When you think vermouth, think wormwood. The vermouth Canado is a hybrid of the two. It is essentially splitting the bitter finish between wormwood and quinine. As a result, you actually get kind of this interesting drying to the finish itself. And so from that standpoint, it's a true vermouth with a quinine finish to it. And in this recipe in particular, even though it's somewhat similar to a vermouth de Torino style, the thing that kind of pops out a little bit is more of a kola nut presence to it. And it makes for a really fantastic Americano, for example, especially with our Grand Classico bitter, if I can put in a plug for that. It really is phenomenal, and I've enjoyed it in Manhattans, especially if I'm using a bourbon as opposed to, say, a rye, for example. If I'm using a rye, I'm probably going to be working with the Di Torino. But it's the Vermouth Canado was a style that was fairly popular up until around the 1950s, and then you started seeing kind of a drop-off and decline. Around the same time that you started seeing a drop-off and decline in the popularity of Quina aperitif wines on the French side of things, it seems that the consumer overall was starting to become less enamored with that quinine flavor profile, and so you started seeing that either being reduced or lessened or eliminated altogether. Now clearly people understand and appreciate the aspects of quinine, and it's kind of come back into favor, and rightfully so, because it works so well with really great base spirits, especially things like gins and things of that sort.
And last but certainly not least, the Vino Canado.
The Vino Canado. The Vino Canado really is a manifestation of the desire we've heard from bartenders for a number of years, which is we really love Barolo Canado, but we can't afford it. We can't pencil it into a cocktail because it's just too darn expensive. And Barolo wine, Barolo from the DOC, is really Nebbiolo d'Alba. That's the wine, the grape varietal. And so if you, amongst other attributes, if it's grown in the DOC, in the Alba region, 100% Nebbiolo d'Alba in a new oak barrel, minimum of 4 years, it gets certified as Barolo. However, in that same region, they grow Nebbiolo d'Alba all over the place. If it's not within the DOC, it's still Nebbiolo d'Alba. It still has a beautiful tannic structure to it. and it's still very desirable. It's just less expensive, and I believe it's about 18 months in the barrel, and you're certified as Nebbiolo d'Alba. So what we did is we took 100% Nebbiolo d'Alba for the wine base and aromatized it just like a Barolo Canado to create really a poor man's Barolo Canado at a price point that is much more reasonable and much more affordable to use. The tannic structure and the beauty of that Nebbiolo d'Alba red wine is absolutely fantastic. And when it interacts with the herbs that we've aromatized it with, it is just absolutely fantastic. And so the way the Italian government structures things in the legislation is you can either do a Barolo Canado or you can do a Vermouth Canado. But if you use any other wine type other than Barolo, it needs to be under a catch-all term of vino. So that's why it's known as Vino Canado. And since it's a Canado and not a Vermouth Canado, the primary bitterness is from quinine. There's a little bit of wormwood in there, but the primary mover and driver on the bitter finish is the quinine. So I think to help people compartmentalize their thoughts on vermouths, Vermouth Canados, Quinas, things like that, is if they focus on what these words actually mean. Vermouth equals wormwood, Canado equals quinine, Vermouth Canado equals wormwood and quinine.
So why would a bartender perhaps want to consider carrying all four expressions of your vermouths? What is that going to do to expand their flavor opportunities in making cocktails?
Well, it's one of really having options and what you'd like to do with it. If you want to make a cocktail with mezcal, for example, the Bianco is really an excellent choice to work off of that kind of base spirit. The Vermouth de Torino is going to be flexible across brown spirits and also herbal white spirits. The Vermouth Canado is going to give you some very interesting attributes that you wouldn't otherwise get from a Di Torino, specifically kind of that cola nut aspect to it, almost a soda pop, if you will. But also it's not overly cloying or sweet, and it's just going to give a nice balance. And sometimes once you play around with these things, it's hard to anticipate what different herbs from a base spirit is going to interact with the different herbs in the vermouth. And sometimes things pop out and sometimes things recede into the background. Sometimes it's hard to judge until you actually start playing around with it. The Vino Canado is going to bring this beautiful tannic structure to it, and in a cocktail it's going to express a lot more fruit than you would from the wine bases that are used in the Bianco, the Vermouth Canado, and the Di Torino. So if you're looking for a little bit of a more of a fruit expression along with that wine contribution in the herbs, then the Vino Canado is definitely one to grab. But also the thing that I'm excited about in terms of an opportunity is especially a bar program that has a food aspect to it, most specifically a dessert aspect to it, because vermouth and desserts are absolutely astounding. I think the era of working with a sweet dessert and using a port or a sweet dessert wine may be starting to wane a little bit, because I think people are starting to look for balance in what they eat and what they drink in combination. And when you have a sweet dessert with a sweet wine, it's sweet on top of sweet, and it tends to be a little overwhelming and a little cloying, and it doesn't really benefit the dessert or the sweet wine. But when you have a combination like a sweet dessert, especially something chocolate, and the herbalness and the slight bitterness that you get from vermouth, the combination together is something much greater as a whole than they are as individual components. And it's whenever I have people try those combinations, they're just blown away, and they're like, how come I haven't done this before? Well, the quality of vermouth that you're drinking now or now have access to wasn't there before, so you might not have done it with the same results. But now you can definitely take advantage of that. So I think in the cocktail application, it gives you a great variety of things to work with, and if there is a food aspect to the program, it certainly gives you even more options.
Where does the Alessio name come from?
It comes from Alessio de Piedmont, and it was a gentleman, kind of a Renaissance man by the name of Rosselli, who in 1555 wrote a book under the pseudonym of Alexis de Piedmont. And he wrote a book at a time when a lot of knowledge was held by the church, and recipes, especially medicinal recipes or home recipes, were something that weren't something that was generally available to people. It was the church that tended to own a lot of the information and the education and the know-how, if you will. So what Rosselli did is he was actually writing something of a how-to book, or medicine for dummies, if you will, that the everyman could utilize to benefit his life. And in some of the writings, they may have been considered heretical to the church, and he could have been persecuted or even killed. So out of concern, he wrote under the pseudonym of Alexis de Piedmont, and he was really exposing, you were starting to see, written down and made available to really kind of the general public in the day, these recipes for these aromatized wines where you're adding different herbs, you're sweetening it with honey and things like that. And this was really something that anyone can do themselves. If they could get wine and they can get a hold of some of the herbs and the honey, they can kind of make their own sweetened wines to benefit their health. And really, commercial vermouths are just a manifestation of, something that people could do on their own. But now you have the convenience of buying it as a finished product, not having to go through the trouble to hunt down the herbs, most of which were rare and expensive and exotic. So this is really what Alexis de Piedmont, or Alessio de Piedmont, did, is he really kind of exposed to a wider audience these recipes for aromatized wine, along with other things like alchemy and other strange recipes and concoctions. But that was really, and he was from the region too, and so owing that it's the birthplace of vermouth, that he was a very special Renaissance person that was kind of involved in these fortified wine recipes. That's where we really took the inspiration for the brand Alessio.
So I know you guys worked on these for a very long time. A lot of work went into it, and I had the great pleasure of being able to kind of taste alongside as you were bringing them to life. Can you tell me about your experience creating these products? What surprised you? Where were the challenges? What was really fun and enjoyable for you to bring this range of vermouths to life?
Well, we had worked on it for about 3 years before the first product was released. The Vermouth de Trino and the Vermouth Canado were the two first expressions we brought out. We wanted to do a range, and for us, the challenge was finding someone we could work with to develop these vermouths based upon these old recipes. To make vermouth is not an easy process, and you want somebody that has experience and background with that. So, we're looking for a vermouthista, a facility that specializes, and that's all they do is vermouth. In Italy, the laws are pretty strict. A winemaker cannot make their own vermouth because the aspect of vermouth that requires the use of high proof is prohibited in a winemaking facility. So a winemaker can't turn his wine into a vermouth. A winemaker needs to take his wine to a vermouth producer and then have it created and turned into a vermouth, and then it could be shipped and sold from there. So we wanted to find a vermouth specialist. The ones we approached, for the most part, they all had kind of a library of recipes, and their preference was, why don't you just pick one that we've already, worked out, and we'll just put your name on it. But that wasn't something we wanted to do. Plus, when we tasted them, we felt they were just okay. They weren't great. So we finally happened upon a producer that was as excited about the exploration of these old recipes as we were, and was willing to work with us. When you're developing a vermouth, it's a little different from like distillation. If I'm doing a distilled spirit, I could probably do a 10-liter batch, and if I like that recipe, I could probably scale it up with a pretty good accuracy up to 1,000 liters, 5,000 liters, etc., with very little modification. With vermouth, if you do less than 100 liters, then if you try to scale it up, because you're using very small quantities of these extracted herbs, that just a slight rounding error could really turn into something that once you scale it up to 5,000 liters, it tastes totally different from your test batch. So you have to do a larger sample size than you would say in a distillation. So we had to do like 100 liters. Well, there were a number of tests where the 100-liter batch was produced, and we took one taste and said, nah, that's not great. So you just ruined a 100-liter batch. And so we did probably about 19 different rounds. So if you expand upon that or do the math, you're looking at about 1,900 liters. Well, it got to the point to where the producer we were working with said, okay, have you come across a recipe that you like yet? I mean, because we're doing all these test batches, it's starting to get a little worrisome because we're using a lot of wine up, and I'm afraid that we may end up having somebody from the Italian government come in and say, can you account for all this wine, or are you selling it out the back door? So, it was tough because we'd come across a recipe and go, wow, that's really, really good, but maybe the one after that's even better. So it's kind of like, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? And so ultimately we had to make some decisions, but it wasn't because we lacked from options. It was just because it was almost addictive. What's that next recipe going to taste like? But I think we dialed in some very, very good recipes from our historic research, and we feel very comfortable about what we offered. But it's, you need somebody that's willing to work with you, and we get a little crazy and we get a little into the weeds and into the details. So to have somebody that was as excited as we were to take that journey of exploration was a huge, huge benefit to bringing this project to life.
And what has your experience been sharing this with bartenders around the country and having a chance to talk with them and see how they're integrating it into their bar programs?
I'd say that's one of the most exciting aspects of it because, I could taste it and enjoy it. People around me on the business side of things can kind of taste it and enjoy it. But when it's out there in the market and you're tasting bartenders on it at first, there's a lot of trepidation. It's like, okay, I liked it, but will anyone else like it? And I know we put a lot of research and a lot of heart and soul into it, and we felt we dialed it in, and we tasted it against competitors in the market, and we felt that it had greater balance, it had greater depth, it had all those attributes we were looking for. So then comes the drum roll. Do the bartenders agree? And if they agree, then they're going to educate their customers, and their customers will start to understand what our vision is. Once we started tasting it, the response has been really overwhelming. One thing that I enjoy is when a bartender has something already in their bar program that they're utilizing, and then I bring my vermouths to the top of their bar, and many times what they'll do is they'll pull out what they're already using, saying, let's just taste it side by side. Well, I love that because I've already done that, and I already know the differences. And the differences aren't subtle. The differences are significant. And when they take the taste of that product that they already have in-house, and then they taste ours side by side with it, and the thing I always love is the look on their face. And it's always this kind of this thought with the eyes rolling up and then this big smile and go, wow, that's fantastic. And to me, that is kind of the capstone of the whole journey. Is it's like, okay, that's the validation. All the years that we spent on this, all the pain and suffering we put ourselves through to bring this to life, to, from the packaging to the juice to everything, to bring that forth and say, okay, this bottle now represents the culmination of all that work and all that effort. Is it a winner, or are they just going to say, eh? And the reaction to the whole range has been really off the charts, and it's something that I hoped for, and certainly something that I appreciate and don't take for granted, because I think we have a reputation to uphold, and we're known for the absinthe side of things. We're known for the cremes and liqueurs. To most people will be new to the vermouth game, so the expectations are high, and we felt the need to deliver, and at least so far the response has been overwhelming. I don't know if I've really had really too many. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to say that there really hasn't been hardly anyone that says, well, I prefer the product we are using to this. It's been almost a little unfair to our competitors, but I think it really helps everybody raise their game, because there may be somebody behind us that does it that much better. So I think that we need to be aware that we're not the only game in town, and we need to offer bartenders interesting choices, but also quality. I mean, the quality has to be there, otherwise our reputation, regardless, if it's not going to perform in the cocktail, then we're not gonna have success with this range. But so far, it's been fantastic.
From your perspective, what are some of the indicators of a lower quality vermouth, and those things that you tried to really improve upon?
Well, the one thing that I've noticed in kind of a lower quality vermouth is that there's not a lot of complexity in terms of flavor, which really, if you look at historic spirits in general, one of the hallmarks that seems to always be present, and I think our cremes and liqueurs kind of underscore and support this theorem, if you will, is that big, bold flavors were the hallmark of a 19th century spirit. This notion of something being simplified or subtle, for example, our creme de menthe, you could probably make one that would be recognizable as a creme de menthe if you just use mint oil in alcohol with sugar. And you'd say, well, it tastes like mint, right? Well, historically, a creme de menthe was far more complex than that and had other ingredients that surrounded and was a supporting cast to the mint. So it wasn't the mint and the mint by itself. It was the mint and other things to be something that's much more enhanced. And when you use it in a cocktail, those other ingredients also work to create a different flavor profile. And so with vermouth, it's a similar kind of a thing. Historically, most vermouths would have, close to 24 different herbs, but it's far cheaper to make a vermouth from a cheap wine base with maybe a dozen herbs or less. And if you're just simply using oils or extracts that aren't necessarily coming from the plant, but maybe, from some kind of extraction facility, then you're not going to have a very complex product that's going to contribute to your cocktail. And the other thing that I notice in a cheaper vermouth is the balance of it. When we were tasting our vermouth samples, we tasted like we would a wine. Yeah, and to me, there's three primary zones that you're looking for. You're looking for the entry, you're looking for the mid palate, and you're looking for the finish. A good vermouth should hit on all cylinders, all three of those points, and there should be some balance and flow to that. What I taste in some products is maybe an entry, the mid palate drops and disappears, and you just get this bitterness in the finish. And to me, that's a poor or an incomplete product, because it's not going straight across your palate and hitting on all those points. It's kind of comes in, drops away, and then just you get this simplified bitterness in the finish. And if you imagine what that's doing in a cocktail, it's not contributing much. It's maybe giving it some wininess, some raisiny sweetness, and that bitter aspect. But where are all those great herbs to interact with the herbs in the gins, or the wood notes in a whiskey, things of that sort. So that's really why vermouths, and using vermouths, kind of around the 1880s forward, was so endearing, is because they brought these qualities to the cocktail that made the sum total of these ingredients something greater than themselves. And it's not something that it's just like, well, we just added that flavor to touch base. It really needs to improve and make that cocktail better. And that's I think that's really the benefit of going back to those 19th century recipes. Also, one of the things historically to consider is what may have happened that led up to the modern vermouths that are available today. Because you start from the origins in the 19th century, when you drink it on its own, it was a luxury wine known as vino de lusso, and then it starts being used in cocktails. And so producers realize, well, we don't have to use as many herbs. We can make it cheaper because it's going to get buried in a cocktail with other ingredients. So how balanced it is and how good it is on its own isn't as significant. And then you run into situations like, prohibition, where in the U.S. market, it's kind of taken out. And then it kind of makes its comeback after Prohibition is repealed. And then you have World War II, where you were not able to get vermouth from Italy or France during the war. And so American wine producers step up and start making vermouths domestically, but it ends up being a slightly different flavor profile. So once the war is over and French and Italian vermouths are now back available, they're running into a consumer whose taste for vermouth and preferences have changed slightly. So it's either you are going to lose sales, or you're going to have to tweak your product to be more similar to what now the new taste is in one of the biggest markets in the world. So most of these producers really changed their recipe and tweaked it a little bit. And then you end up in kind of the modern era with vodka cocktails and things like that. And maybe vermouth producers are starting to tone down the bitterness because people don't like bitter as much. And so you have all these iterations and manipulations from its origins to what it is, in the modern era, or at least, shall we say, the pre-cocktail evolution modern era. And vermouths are just these bottom of the shelf, inexpensive products that people, don't even recognize or realize is based on wine. And so this is the same thing that happened with cremes, creme de cacao, creme de menthe, things like that. And so how did they get that way? So by going back to the 19th century, we have kind of leapfrogged backwards over all these different manipulations and iterations that kind of took vermouth from something that was this well-respected, beautiful, elegant type of product and turned it into this kind of maligned, disrespected, not very good, not very interesting, not very well made type of product. And so now we can kind of avoid all those errors or market corrections, if you will, over a century and a half, and go back to something closer to its more pure form. And just like the cremes and liqueurs, it is exceptional compared to what the market was littered with just a couple of years ago.
The label and the bottle is really beautiful on this, as it is with everything you guys put out. Can you tell me anything about that aspect of the products?
Sure. The label on our products we pay a lot of attention to. We've been fortunate to find some already existing bottle molds for like the cremes and liqueurs that we like quite a bit. With the vermouth, it was a little different because the prevailing knee jerk is to go with kind of a wine bottle, and as we kind of call it, a stupid wine bottle. It's just it's just a nondescript, nothing type of a thing. People don't really pay attention to the bottle and vermouths. But what's interesting about vermouth, just like a number of different products, like absinthe, for example, absinthe had kind of a signature bottle profile. It had a single ring at the top. It was a very unique standard shape for absinthe historically. It was the same with vermouth. Vermouth had a very specific profile, and it was punctuated at the top by a double ring. And that was what was known as a vermouth bottle up until around the 1950s, where we started seeing more products in more simplified wine bottles, if you will, and then ultimately screw tops. And that's really where, vermouths up until, well, even till now, I mean, that's what you're going to see with most every product out there. For us, however, we felt that the profile and the packaging for the vermouth should match the historic nature of the recipes for the juice that's inside the bottle. So what we decided to do was to take an old vermouth bottle. In this case, we used an 1870 era vermouth bottle, and we gave it to an Italian glass producer, and they went ahead and had the profile scanned by lasers in this different chamber. And our bottle was a liter bottle, but we scaled it down proportionate to be a 750, and then ultimately we also did a 375 ml size bottle. And we wanted it to have a couple characteristics to it. One, it needed to be a historic profile, needed to have the double rings at the top. We wanted a deep punt in the bottom, just like a classic vermouth bottle that were typically hand blown. And we also wanted the glass to be substantial, a dark glass to protect it as much as we can from a UV standpoint. And then you're talking about wall thickness, in this case, the heaviness of the glass. And we went with an 850 gram bottle. So it actually makes the bottle look a little larger than a 750, but it feels substantial. And I think that really is a hallmark of a better quality if you're willing to invest in glass, not the cheapest, lightest thing you can get your hands on. And so we started with the bottle, and then we turned towards inspiration from historic vermouth labels to construct the labels that we work with. Vermouth canados tend to have almost a monastic or religious kind of a feel to it. The vermouth de Torinos typically would have illustrations of wormwood plants on it. The canados would often have cinchona bark, or the cinchona plant with the fuchsia flowers on it. And a lot of these labels served historically as these visual cues to the consumer on what's inside. First, if they recognized the profile, they knew vermouth was in that bottle, even if they didn't know the brand. But by looking at the label, it would give them a sense of, is this a vermouth with wormwood? If they see the cinchona bark with the fuchsia flowers, then they'd realize this is probably Canado, because you're assuming that, people were literate and they could read. And that wasn't often the case. So these labels were kind of a visual, almost kind of a comic book illustration, if you will, to someone that could understand what's being conveyed to them, even if they couldn't read the words. And so we take a lot of inspiration in those historic stone lithograph labels, and that's why you're going to see a lot of that kind of style or attribute to our labels. Is the labels are contemporary with the 19th century recipes that we're working with, and the bottle is contemporary with those 19th century recipes. So they all kind of combine together to give you an experience and lead you to expect that what I'm going to drink from this bottle is special and kind of harkens to an earlier era, and we feel that the juice in the bottle also makes that same contribution. So it costs you just as much to produce a cheap label as it is to a label that's well thought out. And so in my view, why wouldn't you take advantage of that opportunity?
Absolutely. And last question, and actually before last question, 2 observations. When given headphones and a microphone, you have a set of honey golden pipes. You have a radio voice, and I feel so soothed right now. I had no idea.
Well, don't fall asleep.
I'm loving it, and thank you for always being so generous with your knowledge and experience and time. You braved the road with us last year on the educational drinking tour, and it's always just a real treat to be able to get you in front of a microphone or a group of people and share your extensive knowledge. So very appreciated. Last question. For bartenders out there that have not gone down the vermouth rabbit hole, what message do you have for them?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say exploration, really. I mean, and it's not just our products. There are products out there now that are, when producers realize that there is a consumer for a better quality product, and they think if they make it, you'll buy it, then they're going to put some attention on that. And if you're willing to pay a little more for a better product, and you let the producers know that, then they're going to work hard to give you a better product. And so bartenders are the ones that are really the ones setting the bar for people like ourselves to recognize, hey, if we make it and we put the quality in there, even if it's a little more expensive than kind of the lower price brands, there is a market for it, and we will be rewarded for that effort. So, we get a lot of inspiration from bartenders because we're simply producing tools for bartenders to use. It's really up to the bartender to take those tools and turn them into something special. And we revel in the creativity and the opportunity to provide these tools and see how they're being utilized, and they're used in effects that we could never envision. I'm constantly out there, and bartenders will say, hey, I made this cocktail using this ingredient of yours or that ingredient of yours. Let me make it for you. And I taste it, and it's like, holy smokes, that is the best cocktail I've ever had. And it seems like every time I'm out there in the market, I keep getting, it keeps topping itself. And it's just this constant amazement that I have for the talent and the creativity for the bartenders that are out there. And I love the questions. I loved how geeky they want to get and ask questions about products and history, and then even political context historically. I mean, all this is just so fun. And I think it really just kind of enhances the experience. And I know that when your average consumer walks in and they sit at a bar, they're not just going to have a cocktail. They're going to have an experience. And the fact that my products are part of that experience that guest is having, and that is a tool that the bartender can leverage, is to me the greatest pleasure in all of this. So that is really a driver for us. And this is what keeps us in a way awake at night, thinking about what other tools can we provide to bartenders. And there are other wine-based aperitif, along the lines of vermouths and the quinas that we think we could also bring to bear that would be relevant and useful to bartenders, along with other cremes and liqueurs that we think would also be relevant and useful. So I would say that if I'm out there and I meet a bartender, if there's something on their bucket list of things they wish they had in terms of a tool that would be helpful to them to further their craft, I want to hear it, because I'm just as curious to see if we could bring something like that back from the annals of history as well. And if it's something that could be used by a number of bartenders and something that improves our genre of the cocktail culture, then yeah, I want to hear it, and it's my pleasure, and I really appreciate the support that bartenders have given us throughout the years and helped us really grow our brand and become something that is pretty well known around the country.
Well, thank you, and I guess until next time, right?
All right.
There we go. Thank you so much for your insights, and I look forward to doing this again very soon.
Me too. Thanks a lot, Alan.
Thank you.